The Knights of Ren podcast is brought to you by Cool Stuff Inc., your source for Star Wars Destiny singles, sealed product, and more. Check them out at coolstuffinc.com.
Show me again the power of the darkness.
D20 Radio, where gamers roll. D20radio.com. All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, to the Knights of Ren, episode 309. With us this week are Rick and Jay. How are you guys doing?
Doing good, like usual.
I'm alright.
So we have some spoilers to talk about, some from the Chance Cube, some that FFG announced with the deck Jeremy Zorn built. But before we get there, Jay went to a pretty big store champ, so why don't you give us a recap on how that went and how you started testing this new deck of yours?
So yeah, over the weekend I went back to one of my usual stomping grounds, Outflank Games, up in Richmond, California, and we had our final store championship of the season in our area. What really made it special was there was a lot of hype and support built around it, and we managed to get 44 competitors into that place. It was one of those impressive moments where, like, that store's, like, you know, pretty nice and pretty well laid out, but it was like, wow, can we all fit in here? And the answer was barely. It was ran really well. Place is owned by a guy named Brian, and he's one of my favorite store owners I've ever met. And yeah, it went off without a hitch, really smooth, really fast. 5 rounds of Swiss, and then we broke just enough to get that top 8 that we've all been wanting in the area. Most of our events, as listeners have probably noticed, you know, like hardly reached 20, so it was really cool to be in something so big with so many people, and some people we hadn't even seen, like, driving out. I think there was one guy who made top 8 who drove 3 hours, so that was awesome. So I mentioned on the past few episodes that I've been playing with a Luke deck that I was a little hush about, because I know that some of our listeners play in my area. In fact, spoiler alert, the person who won this event is a fan of ours, and we'll get to that later. But yeah, I sort of teamed up with Pearl Yeti from Artificery. He got really excited about a hero deck, and after I tried very hard to test a Django FN list that I just went on like an incredibly brutal losing streak, and it was one of those streaks where you lost to competitive decks and just like friends being like, I just want to try this deck that I made for fun, and like I couldn't even like fend that off. And you know, some of it could have been rolls and some of it could have been poor testing. I mean, there's all of that, but I just was like, I don't want to play this deck. And I had a small quarter 3 tournament the next day, and Pearl was like, you have to play this hero deck. And amusingly, to a lot of my friends in the local area, they were asking me that week for a lot of help on hero stuff, and I just kind of shrugged and looked at them and said, I really don't play hero enough to give enough, you know, valued feedback any better than some of the other content creators out there. And then lo and behold, some of my friends who I distinctly told I don't play hero saw me walk into a Q3 with a Luke Ray list, and I managed to take the whole thing pretty decisively, and I fell in love with the deck fairly quickly. A lot of you were probably thinking, you know, like, either I tried Luke Ray and it's slow or janky or has trouble, or, you know, what makes this one special? Honestly, again, like, I haven't played a whole lot of hero, but sometimes I've like swapped decks with my friends when they want to try something or play one of my lists. And one of the things that I notice is, like, hero of course has some really severe resource struggles, and in our current meta, especially with Ankar chomping around, like, you can't really risk not having money or trying to sit on money. So what do? How do you play hero? And somewhat of the answer is, you know, obviously you get the dream rolls and the dream upgrades, and you take your turn before they even get an action, you know, as Ray does, or you use the right upgrades at the right time to spend your resources before they can get destroyed and try to value roll them out. and those were some of the core things in this deck that really shined while also cut out all the bloat. It's almost entirely relies on skillful use of upgrades, insane amounts of rerolls and draw, manipulating, your force speeds and your vibrant knives, and late game your light bows to maximize their damage and try and steal kills before your opponent can resolve their dice on a character, and then kind of steamroll them. So finally, let's get to the list, which I have dubbed Star Killer in honor of that really awesome promo that's been floating around that I'll get my hands on once I go to GenCon. So of course this deck uses Luke and Ray. The battlefield is Maz's castle. The upgrades are 2 Vibra Knives, 2 Light Bows, 2 Force Speeds, 1 Jedi Robes, 1 Luke's Lightsaber, 1 Ray Staff, and 1 Force Illusion. The events are 2 Trust Your Instincts, 2 Caution, 2 Overconfidence, 1 Confidence, 2 My Ally is the Force, 2 Use the Force, 2 Swiftness, 2 Deflect, 2 Heroism, 2 Guard, and 1 All In. So a couple of the choices are sort of select and hopeful for good hands, like Robes. Robes is one of those cards where when it's good and you get it in your opener, it's amazing, but you never want 2 of it. And the times where you can get it and you can use its focus, I find it's a really strong card. I don't usually use it to overwrite, like say over a knife, but, getting it on that early turn or sneaking a shield onto someone sometimes makes a difference. So I think it's worth its slot, even if it's not a reliable opening hand. But of course, this game has the really awesome mulligan rules. Ray Staff. Sometimes you just want to try and make Ray a little more relevant, a little more reliable with their melee sides. It also pairs pretty nicely with Vibra Knife. I would probably play Vibra Knife over it in terms of like trying to run both. Obviously, it depends on what your resource situation is, but usually it was slapped onto Ray if you couldn't draw a knife or one of our other options. And then Luke's Lightsaber was kind of a tech call, and I went over it with Yeti, and we both agreed that it's really only in the deck to give you 1 more 3-coster to avoid Imperial Inspection, which admittedly is funny because there's only 3 cards in the deck that you can build towards to do that, but that did come into play multiple times throughout testing the deck. Luke's Lightsaber is more of a meta call as another option to overwrite and keep your upgrades safe away from Imperial Inspection. Oftentimes, I use it for a reroll, as I would much prefer Light Bow, but there are times where I did overwrite for it, because if I didn't need the knife for destroying shield purposes, there are cards that can manipulate the 3 damage side for 1 or the +3 side, which is pretty good. So overall, it's more of a versatile one-off. The rest of the deck, though, as you notice, is a whole lot of events. And I mean, obviously, you got Trust Your Instincts, which is more draw, more rerolls. Awesome on Luke, awesome for digging for your cheap removal options. Like, I mean, Caution isn't removal, but it's sort of what you're playing it for. Or Confidence, or Heroisms, Guards. All those cards are free, which is really nice, which helps being able to do stuff when you're out of money or you've played a upgrade, or if you're trying to play towards 2 of the main sort of showcases and combos, which, I mean, if you've played Hero Blue, like, it's obvious like what I'm going to talk about, but definitely My Ally is the Force is the force to be reckoned with in this deck. Being able to smash for 6 off of a Luke 3 and then any other melee you have in play, or, and I've used this trick numerous times, resolve Luke's focus and spin it to the 3 and then hit him and use that to, steal a kill or match it with a Ray +2 or a Vibra Knife +2 or both, and just be tricksy and have even more ways of using Luke's die when he doesn't roll super well. And then the other common combo is some combination of swiftness, often used with Use the Force, or when you resolve a force speed, use the Force on its own in the same context of using one of the actions for Use the Force and then the second action to resolve it. So using Swiftness and Use the Force, you can weave a lot of combos out of a lot of these cards. You can Swiftness Force Speed onto Ray and it turns it into an ambush upgrade like all the rest and increases your odds of getting the Force Speed ambush roll. There's just a lot of crazy little combos that this deck offers. So before we get into questions from Rick and Sugi, I already know the biggest one that was asked to me a lot, which is why would I pick Luke over Obi-Wan? With the change to my ally is the Force, I bring up that you can change Luke's focus into a beneficial side, and when you turn to Obi-Wan, he has 2 focus sides, one of them being a 2 focus, which means you can flip his dice and his other die, or his die and one of Rey or a Vibranife into those plus sides and still get some pretty huge hits off. Also, an advantage to Obi-Wan is that you can use his Guardian to pull away, small damage numbers or pull off Vibranife, making it not a threat and reactivating your shields. All good things, but I very, very heavily, when playing this deck, lean on the draw that Luke offers, the 1 health, which some games have caused me to keep Luke alive a little better than I would have if I had Obi-Wan. And also the Obi-Wan version asks of you to have some Force powers in it in order to get maximum use out of Obi-Wan, which obviously, you can use the one with the Force. Everyone still likes Force throws or Force pushes or mind probes. There's definitely stuff to go in there, but, those are slots that I would prefer to have all these event options or the equipment that I've chosen instead. So they're not the same deck, which is one thing that a lot of people like to assert. They're definitely not, particularly for the upgrade choices, and relying so much on focus, as we've mentioned time and time again, can very heavily cannibalize on your dice. And if you're using focus and walking into removal, you might have been better off if you instead spent cards to reroll and still had the same number of dice, and maybe they wouldn't be able to deal with all those said dice. Granted, those are both 2 niche scenarios, and different removal is better against each, but it's just something to consider. And I like the reliability of how heavily I can dig through the deck using Luke's ability, using Trust Your Instincts, and using Maz's Castle if I draw Deflects and I'm not playing against a ranged deck, or at least a ranged deck that doesn't have any sides worth deflecting. I've often learned that unless I'm turning off, a modifier chain, or if I'm hitting a rocket launcher, like rocket launcher tends to be deflected. But anything smaller than that, like 2s and 1s, sometimes just aren't worth the resource in the card, and I'll often still throw it back, depending on what I'm up against. It's something to consider with this deck. But I still think Obi-Wan is also like a potentially really strong option, and his ability to make shields a little more reliable can't be denied. But I think the draw with Luke helps you dig for force speeds, helps you dig for answers, and gives you the most rerolls that you could need to make the early rolls matter, unless you've just been, removaled out. But I feel like in that scenario, it wouldn't matter what deck you're playing.
My first thing I definitely want to ask is, you've pretty exclusively played villains up to this point. What is the draw in this hero deck that makes you interested? Because most of the things you want to do are inside of a villain archetype.
So what I enjoyed about this deck is the creative flexibility offered by force speed, swiftness, and cards like My Ally is the Force. I felt like there were a lot of times where I had tricks and plays to manipulate my dice suddenly to get pretty big swings. The other thing about this list that really mattered a lot to me was in a meta where a lot of the gameplay has turned to trying to blow up a character as fast as possible. Some decks are very headhuntery and try to go for the big guy. Other decks prey on the weaker targets just to get dice off the table, and then one way or another, hopefully they can capitalize on the target that remains. What I really enjoy about this particular list is similar to my IGFN list. Both of these characters can close. One of the biggest changes we made to the deck was it used to have lightsabers instead of light bows. And I was talking to Yeti, and I was like, you realize if you My Ally the Force light bow, you can still do 6, just like Luke. And suddenly Rey became a much better closer, being able to manipulate her die and rest on her and still be able to use My Allies of the Force even after Luke died. Still being honest, like, it's still probably better to cut down Luke, as it dramatically decreases your chances of, you know, like getting easier resolutions off that card, which, you know, the big game changer is My Allies of the Force. But it's still possible with Rey. Lipo can, you know, hit hard. It destroys shields, which is great for the mirror or, you know, fighting other shield hero decks in general. But yeah, I mean, I was kind of drawn to it because I was having success. It is very explosive. I don't want to say like it feels like emo kids, because they both have like incredibly different play styles, but it did have that sort of crazy damage potential where sometimes turns 1 and 2 are just like over very quickly and someone's already dead. It did feel similar in that way, even though both decks take different routes to get there. And I just kind of liked how, again, like how much it drew was really intriguing, sort of relearning that drawing, as we've all started to see, is just a good thing. Getting more rerolls, finding those cheap cost cards to be able to respond or build your position. I've noticed a rise in Aftermath, which, as a lot of my friends were testing 3 and 4 character lists, I was pushing really hard for them to consider both Award Ceremony and Aftermath, because you're able to dig so heavily through your deck, fish out those Aftermaths, and then get a serious resource lead. And I'm noticing that that kind of translated into stuff like what Rick played with the Rainbow, digging for it with Boundless Ambition, which, you know, mostly the same combo. Card draw, as everyone sort of laughed at Luke when he was revealed, like, what do you need card draw in this game? You draw so much already. It's super relevant, and it makes a lot of difference. In fact, a lot of times, depending on what I've drawn, often going in with Luke first and just trying to find one more card into your hand to see if that can change your options and play styles, or maybe grab another weapon and throw it right on Rey instead of rolling her first, dramatically changes like how your turns play out.
All right, so the next question most people are probably going to ask is, how does this deck stand up to such a heavily aggressive and explosive meta? Pomaz is like the first deck people are going to talk about. Followed up by that, you're looking at FN, Unkar, and then your emo kids. All these decks have explosive capacity to just throw out significant amounts of damage. What does this deck give you to help either sustain against that or give you a way to dodge some of that explosivity?
So depending on the matchup, one of the things is Luke naturally hits hard. He's a lot like Vader. Sometimes you try to just get him out first, use some of your abilities and just go. Obviously, using the Rey combo-y shenanigans, if rolled well, again, you can take your actions before they get a chance to respond and play their tricks or get their inspections or their salvage stands out. Depending on your matchup, weapons are really good, and they're a good way to get your money off the table. Other matchups, weapons aren't as good, so being able to identify that. If you're playing against decks like Pomaz, like cards like Caution become much better because a lot of the damage dealt by that deck, you know, isn't Vibroknife unblockable, so you can shield up very heavily, try to use heroism to pull dice away before, you know, Maz gets rolled. I've played against a few Pomazes with this list. I often just try to eviscerate Maz as quickly as possible, because if Poe is rolling slowly, I feel like I have better odds of answering his stuff, less chance of like bowcaster second chance shenanigans. Like, I try to just take that off the table and fight Poe honestly and hope to deflect him or, you know, just beat him back with all the rolls and options. And actually, another thing that's really great, especially in the Poe-Maz matchup, is again, with all these cards you're drawing and with how efficient you're being, Poe-Maz's ability to planetary you is slightly worse because your turns should be better than average. So theoretically, them being able to draw the game out, you've done more significant plays before that too becomes an actual tax to you. Also, again, if you can generate shields, or there's a singleton of Force Illusion in here to help you absorb one of the nastier blows, like a thermal or a Millennium Falcon, to help just prevent all that damage. So I actually think the matchup is pretty good. I mean, Pomaz sometimes does Pomaz things. To speak specifically about the tournament and how I performed, I played against Pomaz. I played against Qui-Gon Rey. I played against Rainbow Villain, which I lost to. Actually lost to it twice, 2 different competitors, one Night Sister, one Guard. But I've played a range. I've played Palpatine a few times, and again, just a lot of the strengths is like more efficient than average turns, being able to set up Rey to do really disgusting chain cheat actions to try and, again, efficiently do your stuff before you get hit. But spoiler alert for the tournament, I ended up taking 8th. I made the top 8 cut, but both of those Rainbow Villain lists rolled rocket launchers like champs. That was largely where a lot of damage came from that I wasn't able to stave off. One competitor, his name is Michael Lynch. He's been around for a while. He and I personally haven't played much, but he managed to double Boundless on the same turn, and he dropped like 6 weapons out of both of those, and most of them did what they were there for. And even though I had a Force Illusion and I cautioned Luke and he had 6 health left, he got blown off the table in the top 8 round, and that was about as disgusting as it could have been to knock me out of the event, which was really rough.
So yeah, just taking a look at the choices that you made here, you and Pro Yeti. One of the ones, like, I've played this list a lot. One of the things I found that All In wasn't very good with this deck. Were you getting any good output out of that card, or could it have been something else, do you think, during that tournament?
I have a funny relationship with All In because I definitely mentioned one game, like, why do I play this card? I looked at it. It often was used for rerolls, but humorously enough for me, especially during this event, when I drop an upgrade that has ambush or a, swiftness, a 4-speed, this entire event, anytime I did that where I got another action to potentially trigger the 4-speed, I didn't get it. I would get the miss, I would get the shield, or I'd get the focus. And one of the times where I got the focus, it was one of the turns where I flipped Luke first, and I was able to use that All In, focusing off of the speed die, and use swiftness and hit for a really gross 6 damage instead of using the 4-speed like how I would have liked. And that play swung the game. I can't honestly say, though, even when that helped me out so much, it is pretty much a flex card. There are a lot of good options you could put into this deck, and I'm not a super fan of it. It seems like it would do well, especially when you roll all those annoying focuses, but again, this is a 9-die deck, so you don't tend to have a ton of die or a ton of weird different values. I mean, sometimes you have melee and sometimes you have specials, but I'll admit All In is not a star in this deck.
Yeah, one of the things that I've liked in that spot there has been Determination, the one that it's a 0 cost. If you have a die showing focus, resolve one of your die as the choice, you get the choice, right? So what that allows you to do a lot of times is, if you're having Luke's focus on the board and you don't want to cannibalize that, you can use that on one of either Rey's one resource or one discard or something along those lines to turn that to a focus to change Luke's die. Also, something that's good about it turns your 4-speed into 6 specials. If you have a focus showing anywhere, be it Luke or robes, or even the 4-speed itself is on focus. So that's another option in there. But just looking at the rest of the list, it seems pretty good. You got your mitigation with the guards, the deflects, the overconfidence, and confidence. Now, granted, Hero Blues mitigation is very, very much determined on what you roll yourself or what your opponents are showing. And confidence is great for being able to snipe out certain dice that, you can deal with, but, you don't want them to actually reroll into something else. But it is what it is. It's what Blue Hero has right now. But yeah, the only other thing that I would like to talk about is the battlefield. I really haven't liked Mazda's castle. It gives your opponent such a good advantage for taking for claiming before you, and you don't really gain as much out of it with Luke as you would with somebody else, because you can dig through your deck so fast anyway. Were y'all testing anything else out on this?
Personally, I hadn't used the battlefield before, and I really appreciated the gains I was getting out of it, especially when I drew cards that weren't useful or relevant, especially like cautions when Luke's dead or things like that. So I've found it to be integral to the way I play the deck, but I've definitely seen like secluded beaches and a couple of other options. I mean, if you want to use a more varied, if you want to use a different battlefield, I completely understand. I hadn't used this battlefield before. I feel like it definitely aided my gameplay, but I wouldn't exactly say it's integral. Also, in regards to your mention of Determination, Determination is a card that was suggested a great many times, and I actually meant to replace All In with a Determination for the event, and with everything else going on, getting ready for the event, I just didn't think of it. But I would highly, highly recommend it for the reasons Rick mentioned.
And, of course, I've got to ask, you've got a lot of cards that cost money. Now, your damage output doesn't, thank God. But how are you gaining enough resources to play things like, say, My Ally is the Force for 2, and then still being able to play out some of your control events that cost you any kind of resources? Say, for example, you wanted to do My Ally is the Force, resolve some damage, do swiftness into, a guard or deflect, so you can do these shenanigans. Are you able to actually pay for these combinations of cards?
So that's where I feel a lot of the skill and sort of trust you have to have with your ability to play the deck. It's one of the things that drew me to the deck was learning, again, how to play with incredibly limited resources. Again, similar to my IGFN list, where the most common criticism was how you make money. And to me, it's not how do you make it, it's how do you make sure you don't lose it. I came to learn in some of my earlier games that I really, really, really leaned on My Ally to the point where I would forsake upgrades, and I've since learned that's not necessarily the strongest option, since upgrades give you more dice on those early rerolls to potentially be able to do damage with everything you have going on, and you kind of want to build up these stronger characters and then hope to use My Ally more as a finisher. Obviously, if you roll out early and you have the 2 resources and you can make a sick My Ally play, make the sick My Ally play. But again, a lot of the removal I try to use costs nothing. I almost always try to get a 2-coster on Ray as fast as possible. I try to float 1 to threaten deflect or overconfidence. Being able to float run and go into the next round with 3 tends to feel really good. Again, My Ally is stronger, more swiftness shenanigans, things like that. And again, obviously, depending on what you're playing against, being able to float resources or not may or may not be possible. Basically, though, on your first turn, unless you're up against like Pelp or something and you really want to make sure you don't take some really nasty hitter combo, I play really aggressive round 1, and then I really hope that I can play aggressive round 2 again, and that shields and free removal will allow me to not lose Luke in 2 rounds. If I can make that kind of foothold, I feel like 4 resources go really far, and again, with all the draw in Maz, and if you get your battlefield obviously, but with all the draw and so forth, you should be able to identify the best course for your resources, and if they're in danger or not.
All right, and then the traditional question, when you're looking at that first 5-card hand, what are some of the things you really want to see? What are some of the things you really want to put back into the deck? Especially considering you're realistically going to have a 6-card hand as long as Luke is alive. So, there's 5 in your hand and then +1, turn 1, turn 2, so on and so forth.
This deck really wants to abuse speed for all it's worth, so I definitely look for speeds. I definitely want a 2-cost upgrade, ideally Vibra Knife. Robes is also excellent, obviously turn 1. I'm not upset if I draw Staff. I tend to throw Lightbow and Luke Saber back. I don't tend to hang on to Force Illusion, and my ally as the Force is tricky. Very, very much pay attention to what your opponent is capable of. I've made some awful errors in keeping cards in my hand and not having my battlefield and then getting hit by discards and losing it, which really sets you back on this list, unfortunately. So know the potential of your opponent dropping discard, especially early. I mean, in that top 8 game again against Mike Lynch, he rolled Vibra Knife on FN, got the discard, and then he rolled him out and got discard again, and that was probably the best thing he could have rolled that game. It really it hit that, and it hit another Vibra Knife that I was sitting on. I had already played round 1. I had drawn the second Vibra Knife, and I had the My Ally in my hand, and him hitting both of those was pretty much a turning point that really stole the game away from me, as well as his, again, I for perpetuity, his really consistent rocket launchers. Oh my god. But as far as things not to keep, again, I really, really stress that you should try and be all you can be round 1, and abuse as many of these layers and strategies as you can. I actually really, really enjoy Trust Your Instincts as an opening card. You can almost always assume you have to reroll something, you'll get another draw, and again, you'll just have a better impression of what your options are. If you have that in your opening hand, you can roll Luke first, draw a card. If you don't like what Luke rolled, use that, draw another card, and again, maybe find that speed, maybe find a second speed, maybe find that knife that you didn't draw, things like that. So your draw is really versatile, and again, just like Suji said, don't forget that you have more, and that more can change like the entire landscape of your turn. So the last question that I'm sure, again, is going to be asked is like, how strong do I find the deck? And what a lot of people will tell you, and what I've grown to agree, is while this deck is explosive, and if things go its way enough, it can beat a lot of the meta lists. Can it do it consistently? Not based on specific cards. Again, as much as I say, like, you can use money skillfully. I mean, I've been hit by Salvage Stance, and it's brutal. Or, of course, same way with Vader Raider, trying to rely heavily on your natural rules and getting them eaten up by flanks and electroshocks and best defenses and stuff. If they can handle Luke and then start, hitting him in the face, unless you can bring it back as hard as you're getting it, you're gonna have a rough time. Again, I do enjoy the fact that I feel like this deck can come back from a behind position, and it does have a lot of creativity and tricks to make really explosive turns. One of my opponents, I played against a Snap Baze during the event, and I had managed to get Snap down to 1 health, and then he dug in, and then I had rolled Luke's natural 3, and I had an opportunity to My Ally as the Force, and so instead of wasting one of those 3s, or actually both 3s on Snap to kill him, I put it all into Baze, and then on my next turn, cunningly using Force Speed and My Ally as the Force, I rolled out my dice and managed to finish off Baze, and then use the 1 Vibra Knife damage to kill Snap all in 1 turn. Both of his characters died. His jaw was agape with how quickly that match ended, as he showed me the hit and run in his hand. So again, if you enjoy being creative and you like to assess, again, how to use your money wisely, how to manipulate your dice and make sudden surprising plays and making the best of the worst, this deck can do you very well. I won't pretend and say like this is a top contender for GenCon. I don't think it's a bad choice necessarily, but Luke can be really finicky and a huge pain in into trying to get him to do what you want. Possibly with 2 determinations, maybe cut out the all-in and the confidence and put in 2 determinations. That might swing even more consistency into the deck. And the other nice thing is those cards are free. Good against Dunkar, if they're trying to discard you out. So I very much enjoy the deck. I'm going to test other things for GenCon. I admit I'm probably not going to take it to GenCon, but we'll see. I haven't completely written it off yet. When it's good, it's good. It has a lot of ability to be strong early. It has a lot of ability to get the cards you want as soon as you need them. And it has a lot of ability to, make very strong plays on the first 2 turns. And if you make the right choices, if you hit the right targets, you could, decide the game very quickly. But as I've learned, it struggles against very high health lists, lots of Guardian, a lot of the stuff that's becoming more prevalent now with these 3 character lists floating around. I did not play against the Phasma player that won this event, but I did play against Phasma in a recent quarter 3 tournament, and he knocked me out, just stripping me away with flanks and electroshocks and Guardian. It really made it hard to keep any die on the table if I didn't get any 4-speed shenanigans. So all those things can make it difficult for this deck, but if you like hero and explosivity, I think it's strong. So lastly, I want to mention the winner of the tournament is a player who many of you know as Astrolad on Discord. His name is Tristan. I am not even going to attempt to pronounce his last name, but it was really cool to see him. He's been at a lot of events, but we've constantly missed each other. We just never played, but we've seen each other often. But he played a very strong Phasma list, which we'll be sharing. He played extremely well. He chewed his way through Pomaz. He took down Rainbow Villain multiple times. He played a different Luke Ray. He didn't play me. Baze Ray, all different lists. And he managed to take the top spot. And I'm pretty sure that was his second store championship win. So congratulations to him, and thanks for listening to the show, man. And good luck in your future stuff. It's too bad you won't be joining me in GenCon.
Man, that sounds like a lot of fun, and having so many players show up to a store championship is really good. People are asking, is the game dead? Obviously not. There's lots of players. There's more coming in. Significantly more people are coming into the game than people who are selling out, and that's what's exciting. Is it is a growing community. And with that, we have a new set coming out, and FFG spoiled a couple cards that we're going to discuss from the Jeremy's Wern deck. So the first up is the red A280 blaster rifle. This is a hero only card. Costs you 2 resources. You get a die that has 2 range damage for 1 resource, plus 1 modified side range damage, plus 2 modified side range damage, 1 resource, 1 special, and a blank. And the special is give 2 shields to your characters distributed as you wish, and this card has redeploy. So right off the bat, this seems to be a counterpart to the F11D rifle. It costs you 2 resources. It's got redeploy. It has a special, and the special on the villain side is you get to deal 2 damage distributed as you please. This is you get to give yourself 2 shields distributed as you wish. So it's kind of interesting, especially if you run Finn, that you have access to both of these weapons. It's really nice because, heroes always needed less expensive equipment that gets you more damage out on the field. I mean, the 2-for-1 is the only base damage side, so it's going to cost you money to resolve the damage, which I'm not a fan of because heroes have a hard enough time as it is. I really wish that 2-for-1 was free, but 50% of the die is damage, even though it comes in modified flavor. So I don't think this is a bad card by any means. I do think there potentially are better things out there, but for what's available at this moment in time, this seems pretty potent. What do you guys think?
I have a hard time trying for damage from Hero Red because, and I'm the broken record here, but it's a trap. You're gonna hit that +2 modified side with red ranged if It's a Trap becomes relevant for the match. But, this card can be used almost more efficiently for damage if used in conjunction with Trap. Shields... Heroes can take advantage of the shields and, place them on characters and use cards like Heroism or use abilities like Guardian. Like, there's ways of still getting value out of shields that, aren't all insanely countered by Vibroknife. It's not as good as the F11 damage, clearly, but I wouldn't rank it as useless. I feel like there are ways of taking advantage of it, and as we'll get to later, I mean, there's even a character who responds to shields, and potentially there may be even more support for shield-related cards. So I don't think it's a wash. I think red hero trying to get some good range damage added to their list. Like, I don't think by any means this is a bad card. I would personally probably run it over the A180, which is that 3-cost gun with Jin on it, because it has the redeploy, because it's cheaper and easier to play. I think it has a spot. I mean, again, it's not as dramatically powerful, and the special isn't as strong as being able to deal damage, but in conjunction with other effects that Red Hero already does, it doesn't seem as weird or out of place to me as a lot of people feel.
Yeah, I mean, there was a time when F11D was considered one of the best weapons in the game, and the only difference between this is shields instead of extra damage, which is a big difference. But like you guys said, heroes having the ability to take advantage of those shields a little bit better than the villains do. It's definitely playable. I mean, it's going to slot right into any deck playing It's a Trap, like what you said, Jay. So, I mean, it's an all-around good weapon.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, at least for me, since I'm always thinking about economy and cost curve, is the ability to reduce the cost of getting dice into play is helpful, because villains have a really easy way to create resources, and heroes just really don't. So design-wise, like if you're looking at, the game design mechanically, instead of giving heroes the ability to create resources, you can just reduce the cost of cards. So now they've got access to a 1-drop blaster, they've got access to a 2-drop blaster, you can throw in your holdout blaster on top of that, so both of those have redeploy. If you consider training an upgrade, depending on, which cards you're playing, you can also think about overkill. So all of these cards cost 2 resources or less, which means now you can afford to pay for the 2-for-1 damage sides, the 3-for-1 damage sides, or even It's a Trap, and get out maximum amount of damage without having to pay astronomical amounts of resources that are very hindering when you think about it.
Also, lastly, don't forget about rearm. Being able to rearm this from your discard pile onto a die, and then knowing that it will redeploy, makes both the rearm and the card itself much more valuable, and it's easy to get out. You can overwrite using that action, or just pay 1, which allows you to maybe pay for the 2-for-1 side or the It's a Trap.
All right, moving on, we got Recycle. It's a neutral gray event, 1 cost. Discard one of your supports from play, then gain resource equal to its cost. Really kind of excited for this one because we've always wanted a way to get backup muscle recharged, and you can run this with the docking bay to get rid of your empty backup muscle, gain your resource back, and then claim and play backup muscle from your discard pile for free. So, I mean, that's when I'm looking at it directly with what's existing already. But of course, with Hera, this thing just gets kind of bonkers, being able to really pump out some resources for essentially for free. So I think in a Hera deck, this is a definite auto include. And, outside of that, with the edge cases with backup muscles and stuff like that, it's pretty good if you can fit it in there.
I really like this card for both hero and villain for 2 totally different reasons. First of all, like you said with Hera, using her special, she can get a vehicle out of your hand onto the field for free. But if it's still on the field at the end of the turn, it bounces back to your hand. So something that comes up kind of as you play the game is you'll have hands where you'll be sitting on like, say, 2 Millennium Falcons. And since that card is unique, you can't actually play them. And so that's kind of a problem people have had with unique cards is, I want to run 2 of this card because I want to see it more consistently. But drawing both of them blocks up your deck and creates a clog, which is extremely dangerous in Destiny because you really want that card to be something usable. Now with Recycle, that's not a problem because you can play out the Falcon with Harris special for free, let it do its thing. Hopefully you have that one resource. That's important, but you should theoretically have one resource available. So then you use the recycle to get rid of the first Millennium Falcon. Then you can play the second Millennium Falcon because, you would have made $5. So you can replay itself, roll it out again. So you could theoretically get, 4 damage out of the Falcon, recycle it, play the next one, get another 4 damage out of that, and then whatever else you have left. So it opens up some really unique combination plays. It's also interesting because for both hero and villain, it's almost like it's like a bad version of Quad Jumper. So once you play out Quad, you get whatever die roll you get. But then on top of that, as an action, you could sacrifice Quad Jumper to jump into something at a cost reduction of 3 resources. Well, now if you play something out, say like a TIE fighter, or you play out, say the next card we're about to talk about, there's ways to utilize those cards late game to turn them into resources that you can then use to essentially poor man's jump into a bigger vehicle, a bigger support, or basically trade out a support you don't need for an upgrade you do need. So I think it's really, really unique that you can turn things on the table into money, which then you can translate that into whatever you want at the time. I mean, the sacrifice is expensive if you get rid of something that costs you a lot of money, but I do like the fact that Destiny is finally allowing you to transition things that you invested into to sacrifice them for something else that you need in case you A, don't want it, or B, you've got something else that you can utilize to either get a lethal blow, or you can, move yourself into a much more advantageous position with a different card that you can now pay for.
Next up, we have a new vehicle, which is the T-47 Airspeeder, which is a 2-cost gray support. Its die sides are 2 ranged, 1 discard, 1 shield, special, and a miss. And its special is exhaust a support or draw 2 cards. And this is hero only. So a lot of people are going to compare this to cards like Speeder Bite Scout. And one of the things I think Lucas and Jeremy have learned throughout making this game is they can probably push supports a little harder, as it's interesting that this die has two range sides, no modifiers on this thing. It doesn't make money, but for how much you're getting out of this one die, it's pretty well packed. It's really convenient that it's gray. It turns on cards like Pin Down. You can slot this into any list, and I think it's a really well-rounded good card. What do you guys think?
In previous shows, you guys have discussed like specific cards you've seen that would make you want to play hero, and this is the card that makes me want to play hero. First of all, I love Snowspeeders from the Battle of Hoth. That is probably my favorite sequence of events in the entire Star Wars movie franchise, just because like X-Wings and TIE fighters in space are great, but seeing like this snow battle where your guns pretty much are useless and you have to use your tow cable, which I hope they turn that into a card where you can like blow up supports using the tow cable, but that's just a dream. I love how, the characters kind of have to fight this uphill battle in these little air speeders that really don't do anything, where you have to use string to shut down an AT-AT, and it's just really neat. But a couple of things I love about this card, once again, heroes have been struggling in economic advantages. A lot of their really strong cards cost 3, and that is just a prohibitive number when your decks and your characters aren't heavy resource generators. And you could say, sure, what about Hired Gun? Yes, Hired Gun makes money and Akbar makes money, but Akbar doesn't really deal damage consistently, and the Hired Guns eat the money they make to deal damage consistently. So there isn't a well-created hero that can build economic resources advantageously nearly as efficiently as villains can. So this card does a lot of things you want. First of all, it's 2 resources, and it gives you a 1 in 3 chance of dealing 2 damage. for no resources. That's great. That's perfect. You can also hit the discard, which is very beneficial. The shield, sure, that's fine. But the special is also extremely good because you can either exhaust an enemy support, which this new set coming out has a lot of supports. You know, we're talking about Quad Jumper. We're talking about Slave 1 and ATST. It's probably going to be much more commonplace to see Quad Jumper get somebody into a Slave 1 or an ATST, and being able to turn it off with an Airspeeder is really strong. If your opponent isn't playing supports, you get to draw 2 cards, and that's what I really like about this is the card and the die are extremely synergistic. It can do damage, it can draw you cards, which means more rerolls, more options. There isn't really a die side on this I don't want to see. Obviously not the blank, but if I roll out any of these things, I'm totally fine with it. And none of them are so exponentially important that I feel like an opponent is going to remove this die. So unless this is the only base side in some kind of chain modifier, I don't think that this is really going to become a threat. And that's the best part, is this is actually a really powerful support sitting on your field. And you can also have 2 of them. They're not relegated to 1 because of unique rules. So I find this to be very, very useful for heroes. And thematically, it's like my love of all vehicles. All right, so we also have 4 more spoilers from the Chance Q podcast. And of course, the one I really want to talk about is the Chance Cube. This has sparked a lot of debates. A lot of people are talking about this card, and it is incredibly polarizing how people are like, it's really good, it's really bad, it's really decent. Like, this card is all across the board. And so I just want to sit down and take a moment to talk about this card. So first of all, this is a neutral, zero cost upgrade equipment. That's important. The die faces are 1 resource, 2 resources, 3 resources, blank, blank, blank. So 50% of this die is blank. Okay. Then the text on this card says, before you activate attached character, return this upgrade to your hand unless you spend 1 resource. So there is a lot of meat to this card, what it does, what it doesn't do. So the first thing we need to discuss is, we've talked about like expected value in previous shows. So this card doesn't cost anything to play. It does cost an action, but it doesn't cost anything resource-wise. However, when you the first time you activate the character, you put it on whoever you want. You know, Unkar, Luke, Jabba, Vader, Palpatine, doesn't matter. You put it on this character, you activate that character, you have to pay $1. You have to pay 1 resource, or this card goes back into your hand. There are some combinations where, you know, you can utilize that, but we'll get into that later. So, yet, right off the bat, this card always costs you 1 resource. Unless for some reason you just really want to stall, play this card, activate your character, and bounce it back to your hand, which, I mean, it's totally fine. It's a, you know, null action, but realistically, you want this to stay on your field. So first of all, it costs you 1 resource just to get rolling. No pun intended. Secondly, half of this die is an EV of -1 resource. Those blanks are basically, should just say, lose 1 resource. The next thing you have to consider is the 1 resource, if you resolve it, first of all. Just because you're showing it doesn't mean you're actually going to resolve it. So if you show the 1 resource symbol and then choose to resolve it, your net gain is 0 resources because you paid 1 to roll it, and then you made $1. Of course, you know, people argue, well, what if this is your 1 base resource and you roll it with Unkar and he has 2 + 2 modified sides? Sure, in that instance, you've net 4, but we're talking about the Chance Cube card and die by itself, not, you know, adding in modifiers, because that does change and adjust this, you know, discussion. So realistically, 1/3 of this die is useful. The 2 side and the 3 side, which if you really look at your economy are 1 and 2, because that's what you're netting, considering you've paid to roll it, and then perhaps you made some money. So on terms of economy, I absolutely hate this card because I would way rather have a data pad or a supply line where I just paid $1 and I'm going to get something out of this every time I roll it. Even if I roll a blank, I'm still fine. When you roll a Chance Cube and you roll a blank, you just lost $1. And of course, people will say, well, what about rerolls and all these things? Absolutely. You can spend cards to reroll this die, but the problem is you're spending more resources to hopefully gain some kind of economic value out of the card. And that is where the trap lies in Chance Cube, is you can look at this and say, oh, I can do, focus. I can do bait and switch. I can do all these combinations. Or if you think about this, why don't you just play something else and not spend that one resource? Because if you play Chance Cube and you roll it, you spent $1. And if you happen to roll that one resource and then you play bait and switch, sure, you've changed it to a 3, but realistically, you only made $2. And you've also lost 2 cards out of your hand for an economic gain of 2 resources, which unless you spend them for something really important, say a 4-drop, there's a lot of choke out there. Salvage stand is still very prevalent. There's a lot of ways you can lose your resources faster than you can make them. And using Chance Cube as a quote unquote reliable means I don't think that's a good economic investment personally. If you want to talk about the combinations of things, we've written an article and someone was talking about, well, what about Power of the Dark Side? This is easy fodder. You put this out, you roll out Power of the Dark Side, get free easy damage. It's much more reliable. Okay. That's a combination that is possible, but you have to consider this. First of all, you have to have these cards in your hand. Second of all, you have to have 3 resources. You have to have 2 for Power of the Dark Side, and then you have to have 1 to keep Chance Cube in play. Say you roll literally anything. You roll a blank, you roll the 3 resources. Okay. Now you have a conundrum, because if you roll a resource side, are you going to sacrifice that to Power of the Dark Side to get damage potentially? Or are you going to resolve the resources? And if you resolve the resources, you spent $2 on Power of the Dark Side that didn't do anything, which is not beneficial in any form or fashion. So then, on top of that, if you decide to re-roll the Chance Cube and you don't get a blank, now what? You've invested a lot of your infrastructure for something that never happened. If you get the blank, great, you've got 2 damage, but you still pay 1 resource every turn to get potentially get 2 unblockable damage. And I just don't think that's a really useful way to spend your resources, especially in a deck like that. Like blue villain isn't making a lot of money, and I'd rather spend that money on upgrades like Kylo Saber, which is going to throw out astronomical amounts of damage, as opposed to a Chance Cube that might get out damage with Power of the Dark Side. Someone brought up, hey, you could have 2 Chance Cubes on somebody, and then you activate that character, you bounce him back to your hand, and you have a 7-card hand for a launch bay. Sure, that's fine, but are you really going to have 5 resources available to play launch bay when you're spending so much on Chance Cube? So I think it's a fun card. Like, it's great for casuals. There may be some kind of means where you can utilize this much more reliably, but at this point, it's a huge sink of economy. And, if you roll out multiple times and you don't make any money, and then you get that 3 resources, you're still in the hole. Like, you're just barely breaking even. And that's my biggest problem with this card, is there's not a net gain advantage. It's more or less just trying to break even. And right now, resources are so tight in Destiny, and I just can't risk trying to get lucky on a die roll to make money when there's so many other much more reliable options out there.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add to all of that is that really the only time I could ever see myself playing this card is if there is something that comes out that triggers off of playing in a upgrade or something onto one of your characters, so that I could play this, trigger that effect, and when I roll them in, it just bounces back to my hand so I can do it again later, or pitch it for a reroll or something like that. Like you said, it's really not worth it to try and get that 1 in 6 3 resource side that you'll hit, hardly ever, right? So yeah, you're, with Power of the Dark Side and stuff like that, sure, it's cute, but is it really worth, taking up slots in my deck to do something like that?
It's interesting to me that both of you only look at it as a luck card, when I'm not going to sit here and say like these things I'm going to mention are a reason to play it, but there are cards in the game that can cause it to be reliable. Obviously, focus does a lot of work. Granted, I realize you're paying a resource to roll it out, you're cannibalizing a die with the focus, and you're netting 2, but as another one of our astute listeners pointed out that I thought was actually an interesting combo was Imperial Discipline, which can allow you to remove its die to guarantee the 3 resource side. Again, that's a funky little combo. It requires a lot of cards. It requires you rolling out. It requires, them not removing it, because what is worse is, getting the setup, getting the good roll, whatever, and then they just, get rid of it, and it was all for naught. But I more just want to point out that there are ways to make it reliable. They might combo one way or another with its bounce or with its, ability to ramp into money or other things. Like, to me, I feel like we can't see it now.
All right, next up we got General Riken, defensive mastermind. He's a red hero with 11 hit points, coming in at 12 and 15 for the elite. His die faces are 1 focus, 2 focus, 1 shield, 2 shield, 1 resource, a blank, with the ability of after you activate this character, you may discard a card from the top of an opponent's deck for each of your other characters with 1 or more shields. So, right off the bat, his ability seems pretty good with shield strategies that heroes kind of have. His die sides are kind of meh, but they kind of go with what he's trying to do, which is mill out your opponents, stay alive, put your dice to where you want them to get out there, be able to claim and mill some more cards or something like that. 11 hit points is good in that strategy. What we're looking at right now is just trying to have as many hit points, as many shields, as many, stay alive effects as you can to be able to mill the opponent out. But, one thing that I did notice on the just now read through is the other characters with 1 or more shields. So I think really the max you're going to see here is maybe 2 die mill with him, best case scenario. So yeah, he will be a new key piece in a mill deck for heroes, but outside of that, I'm not really sure if he could go in really an aggro deck. I don't think you would ever want him in an aggro deck.
Just based on his name alone, I wouldn't consider him for aggro since he's the defensive mastermind, but looking at his die, having 2 strong focus sides, 2 reasonable shield sides, and I definitely want to remind our listeners that if you're thinking of Vibroknife just counters this guy, Vibroknife doesn't remove the shields, so you can technically continue to do, these discard effects if that's what you're built around. Again, I've seen mentions of things like you can team up with Padme and drop diplomatic immunity and have shields for days. How you deal with that knife is tricky, but it's not impossible. And of course, in games where the knife isn't a factor, he could make himself and his teammates really hard to kill, and if you can outlast, and maybe there's more cards in the set that allow you to, take advantage of such a defensive position, maybe that is all you need. We haven't seen all the removal, we haven't seen any other type of cards that could potentially go with it. Obviously, we're not seeing a deck right now. It's definitely interesting in that he's costed so mid-rangey, which affords him so much health, but again, is that what we wanted for this effect? Could he have been smaller and cheaper and maybe been able to throw more rookie pilots with him, as everybody loves and is clearly thinking of running with this guy? No, I'm kidding. But just, how many guys can you run with him? How reliably can you keep shields on everybody? These are all the questions we're going to have to figure out. But even with cards like U-Wing, which its special allows you to drop 2 shields on all characters in your party, you can, set yourself up to trigger him for maximum potential. We'll see.
I have a lot of thoughts about Riken. He's so interesting, kind of like you guys were talking about Hux in the last show. Sometimes I feel like he might be this kind of trap character where you look at him and you go, cool, I'm going to put him at elite with Padme Amidala at elite, and we're going to go to town, just, milling people out. And I think it's very possible. I love his focus. I like the fact that Red and just Hero in general is very, very focus heavy, because that means they're really reliable. And if you put him with Padme, she's got a 2 focus and he's got a 2 focus and a 1 focus. So more often than not, you're going to reliably get out what you want. And with him and her, you can mill 2 cards per turn if you get the special. If you get multiple specials out of Padme, you can max out. If she has a shield on her, you could get 5 cards out of their deck per turn for 2 resources. That's not bad. That's pretty scary. You can add things on like Con Artist or Maz's Goggles to help produce money, and it might work The biggest problem, obviously, is there's no damage in that list. So you have to win through sustainability, and you have to win by milling him out before they kill you. And 11 health from him and 10 health from Padme, it's not too great, so we'll see what happens. But I like the fact that mechanically and functionally, mill is getting a little bit of a boost in the arm for heroes, because right now there is just not a reliable way to do it. And with him, I think we're gaining a little bit better access to some more options that can be usable in the future.
Next card we have is Hidden Agenda, a yellow neutral upgrade that costs 1. Its effect is before you play an event, you may discard this upgrade from play to decrease the cost of that event by 2. I find this card really intriguing, especially since we've been seeing some very heavily costed upgrades. Things like Red Alert and Fallback. We've had expensive upgrades like Rise Again and Endless Ranks, and I do feel like this card can help you position yourself better with less resources. Again, like avoiding disruption or losing resources to different decks. This allows you to sort of bank them. You are netting a resource. There are effects that let you like reduce the cost of things that you play. So all these things together, I think this card could see play. Again, with the previously mentioned stuff, I know a lot of the 4-character lists sometimes like to splash yellow. So again, making cheaper, endless ranks, or even like my IG list, Rick mentioned earlier, I'm going to steal your thunder, but how cool it would be to use this for a card like Salvo, or just cards where like you don't typically want to spend the resources that you start around with, but if you can again like bank this action to do, my ally is the Force, again, another strong 2-cost one that this can just take care of for you. It's cool that it's very usable the turn you play it, and it's great that it's usable, in future turns. I find this card to be really clever and versatile, and I definitely want to try it out in a lot of different lists and see if it, if that one really makes a difference, because I think it can.
Yeah, I have to completely agree. This is just all the things I love. It's an economic gain. You can also use this to keep your opponents on their feet. Some people are saying there's a resurgence in Vader Raider because you can throw this out and then your opponent isn't expecting it, but you can get a free No Mercy if you have 0 resources on deck. So you always have to respect the fact that if Hidden Agenda is on the table, you might take a lot of damage to the face, even if your opponent has no resources. And it helps kind of dampen choke because, without resources, you couldn't do anything. Now, Hidden Agenda gives you the access to big plays and big cards. Someone also brought up, are we going to see dodge and block become playable now? Because with Hidden Agenda, you can have them in your hand and boom, whether you have resources or not, you can just remove all of these dice out of nowhere. So I love it. I love the options it opens up even more because a lot of these cards that are really good but cost prohibitive now become playable.
So yeah, it's it just sits out there. It saves your resources from things that are trying to take them away, like Salvage Stand and things like that, to be used later on. Y'all mentioned a lot of the big ones, cheap Endless Ranks, favorite again, Salvo for free. But, if you just did a quick check of anything that cost greater than 1 on Star Wars Destiny DB, there's a lot of cool things that people aren't playing because they just cost so much. Things that are now seeing play even though they cost so much as well, like Abandon All Hope, things like that. There's a lot of good stuff in here that if it were free and or 1 or 2 cheaper, or if it was free or 2 cheaper, it would see a lot of play. And just for the, opportunity, cost of playing this upgrade on there that's going to stick on there until you're ready to play it. It's pretty great as far as I'm concerned. And even at the bare minimum, you could override it later on if you really had to. But yeah, there's a lot of cool things you can do with this. I'm really excited to start slotting this into something and just making my opponent wonder what I could be up to with my Hidden Agenda. All right, last up we got Secret Mission, Hero Blue, 0 cost, event, choose a color, then discard the top card of an opponent's deck. If that card is the chosen color, gain 1 resource. Pretty meh, but we've kind of been messing around with a villain version of a 4-character list that's a mill deck that uses all of the mill cards and just kind of does damage in endless ranks when it feels like it, just to mill out your opponent. This is, kind of an effect that you could do on the hero side as well. They just don't have as many of them on deck for it yet. So, you're gonna, obviously you'll get one card off of your opponent's deck with the pretty good chance, especially if you're playing against a monocolored deck, of gaining a resource on top of it. Whether or not it's worth slotting in, I don't know. Mill decks, like a patience deck, could use this as just some more reach for them. What do you guys think?
It's interesting. It provides its own unique form of mill. I don't think it's great. So the biggest discussion about this card has obviously been about Starship Graveyard, because we've had so many versions of decks that recur cards on top of the deck, and, there haven't been easy ways to get rid of it. This is an alternative to that, because you know what the card is, so you get rid of the card and you get a resource. But that's really situational. And FFG has gotten rid of a lot of the reasons to do that, with, ammo belt being errata, and just, hero yellow mill decks aren't exceptionally strong. So yes, that is a good counterplay, but I don't think that's necessarily the primary reason this card exists as a counter for that stratagem. I think it's nice, but blue just isn't mill heavy, and that's my biggest question, is like, if I'm going to run this card, I have to have a blue character. Who would I run with Padme or Riken that would give me an advantage I want? And I'm not entirely sure. Now, there's still some more blue heroes to be discovered with the set release, so maybe something will come out that pops and goes, okay, this is a pairing with Padme. This is a character that you want in a mill deck. But at this point in time, not entirely sure where this would slot in efficiently with red or yellow mill decks.
I would argue this card is all about efficiency. I mean, the thing I absolutely like about it is the fact that it's free. I mean, there's no real opportunity cost to playing it. I think if you're strictly evaluating how often you'll get the resource, I see the resource as a bonus, as less than something to hope for a guarantee. I mean, obviously you want the resource, and it's gonna suck when, even against monocolor, you're like, all right, blue, and they flip a gray card, which does count as a color, and you don't get anything. But at the same time, just the fact that you can just play this and, either use this as for a slow play action or just a safe play. Again, it's free. It does exactly what you need it to. I mean, you're trading a card for a card, but I just think, like, it's real. The thing that does make it strong in defense of itself is it is so easy to slot in. I'm not saying this card's gonna make or break mill, but I'm saying, like, it's harmless. It does exactly what it's set out to do, and sometimes it gives you a bonus. So, again, we haven't seen everything else or what the limits of mill are, but for a free mill card, as opposed to things like, Loose Ends, which is a really cool card, but that card's really expensive, or other things, Lying in Wait, that's a hand mill, but you get what I'm getting at. I mean, this is a free card. It does something for free, and sometimes you actually make money off it. So, for what it is, I think it's perfectly fine.
Yeah, just to be a little argumentative on it, I mean, yeah, it has tremendous upside just to kind of be thrown in there on a blue deck that, you could play this, and even if you get the resource or not, but you could, discard a key part of their strategy with it. But is it really worth it? I mean, we're really trying to squeeze the most out of decks that we can. And, now that the card pool, is doubled and soon to be tripled in size, trying to figure out what we're going to put into decks. And I mean, it outside of mill, it'd be really hard for me to try to play this. I get what you're saying. It for what it does, it is absolutely very well costed, good effect, with a, tremendous upside on there. But I just can't see it making the cut and really anything other than a mill.
All right, so that is pretty much the end of the show. We have a couple of shout outs we want to give for a lot of upcoming events. So first of all, GenCon is coming up super quick. So Jay is going to be there. If you're going to be hanging out, let us know, and we'll see what we can do to, hang out and say hi, take a picture, do a selfie, whatever. We've also got NOVA coming up at the end of the month. Rick is going to be there. We are super excited to be one of the sponsors for that event. So check out NOVA if you haven't already. We've got a link in the show notes to that event. There's plenty of Destiny going on if you're in the area and you want to participate in some really awesome events. And we are also starting a brand new show called the Galactic Senate, featuring our Discord and Patreon users. If you haven't listened to that yet, I highly recommend it. It's a roundtable with basically our listeners just talking about topics of interest. And this last week was hilarious. We just got on a huge roll about, like, what do we do when the meta gets stale? Card prices, what are they going to look like once Empire of War comes out? And we took a pretty good ragtag shot at the, super derpy rookie pilot and how many copies of Quad Jumper Agent of Zion has. So definitely check that show out, and thank you so much for listening. We will see you next time, and may the Force be with you.